Welcome back to another episode of the S2 Everything Self-Defense and Beyond series. I'm your host, Nik Farooqui. This is episode 004, and today's title is Save Your Own Ass. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. You're thinking that Nick guy, he comes from a martial arts background and firearms and edge weapons and impact weapons and all that. He's doing another episode on that crazy kung fu stuff, and you would be wrong. Quit judging me. Quit assuming stuff. Today's episode is going to be kind of related to self-defense, but kind of off topic. We are going to be discussing briefly about medical training. And I think that every single one of us, whether you're a self-defense person, whether you're a firearms person, whether you're just an average everyday citizen with nothing to do with any of that, I think every single one of us should spend time in continually training and retraining our medical skills. So there's a few different kinds that most people will get involved in or get exposed to. First and foremost, you have your first aid CPR stuff, right? And I think it should be a mandatory class back in high school, in my opinion, because it's so common and it's a great place to get started, right? You learn how to read some vital signs, ice, elevate, those kinds of things, right? And so first aid CPR is important. The next step that I think people often take is AED training. So basically how to use a defib, zap somebody back to life. I would highly recommend that everybody take that class if you haven't. It's kind of fun. There's a lot of interesting things that you learn about how the human body works that, I don't know, it's just fascinating to me. And then there's a next level of training. And this is kind of what, a lot of concealed carry people and self-defense people will get exposed to. But if you're not in that realm, sometimes you don't even hear about it. And it's what we call TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care. Now, in my honest opinion, I think the name should change. That acronym was appropriate for soldiers and guys that are in war and police officers, SWAT team guys. That applies to that lifestyle, a little bit more tactical oriented, right? But for the everyday you and I, Tactical Combat Casualty Care sounds cool as hell to me, and for somebody else to be like, I want nothing to do with that. So I kind of feel like that name should change for the civilian market, although the content is amazing, okay? So let me give you guys a little bit of background. First thing, I got my first certification in first aid CPR back when I was a teenager. I was working at a fitness facility, a recreational facility, and they actually paid for me to take my first CPR and first aid class. And then some other fitness-based classes, but they paid for the first medical training. I thought it was pretty cool, right? You learn how to do these compressions and learn how to use those respiratory devices and obviously read pulse, and it was just good basic knowledge. Especially for being inside of a fitness facility. Ours was kind of a boutique place, and so we had a lot of elder people coming in, and I'm talking like, sometimes you see anywhere from those 40s and 50s, but then you start seeing a whole lot of like the 60s and up, right? And I'm not saying that's old. I'm just saying you saw people who were more in the established in life ages and not so much in the teenage ages. And so I learned it. I was barely a teenager. I was in high school at the time, and so I learned a little bit about that, okay? And so every couple of years I'll go back and recertify and keep my certification current. And it's been interesting because a lot's changed from the way I learned it back then to now, right? So technology's changed, medical devices have changed, just the understanding of the human body continually changes. So the medical industry is constantly evolving, and so we have to continually go back and revisit the same lessons. And then AED training, I learned that from them as well. Although back then it was not really a certification kind of course. It was mostly like a kind of a crash course, like, hey, grab machine, place thing on chest, hit the go button. And so there's all kinds of that kind of stuff happening. And in those days, people start really worrying about the AED certification because they're like, yeah, first aid I can kind of get, but now you're talking about electrical currents and stuff. And so people were comparing that versus legal liabilities. And so Good Samaritan laws and rules kind of expanded a little bit and started covering people for those kinds of actions as well.
So what can you do and what can't you do? Well, one of the good things about living in Illinois, not that there's very many of them, but one of the good things here is that we have one of the most robust Good Samaritan laws. The American Medical Association is headquartered out of Chicago. They get a lot of pull. So what our system is set up around is what would a reasonable person do under similar circumstances. So if you do any of the interventions we're going to talk about today, you're going to be good. Whip out your pocket knife, start doing some open heart cardiac massage, you're pretty much on your own. And to give you an idea what the legal standard is set at for Illinois, you have to be both willful and wanton in your acts. Which means
the difference?
Yeah, it's a huge difference. Not only do I have to do something that I know is going to hurt you, I have to do it with the intention of hurting you. And it has to be proven in a court of law. At the end of the day, almost nobody in Illinois has ever gotten successfully sued for rendering aid to somebody, doing the right thing at the right time for the right people. So don't get too crazy wrapped around the axles on, hey, can I touch this person, can I not?
And then this TCCC thing came about, and it really didn't come into the civilian market until fairly recently, believe it or not, relative to everything else. That came in the market after concealed carry started becoming a thing, and you got more and more people who are coming out of the military, from Afghanistan and such, and they need to make a living as civilians. And so they started to produce courses that were driven more towards that tactical-minded person. I'm of the opinion that the average every single day person, whether you're into this tactical world and martial arts world or self-defense world or firearms world or not, okay, because I learned a lesson from a good friend of mine that rings and resonates in my head all the time. So my friend Brian, who is the lead medic for the Chicago PD SWAT team, comes from a long background in the military, came out of the military, joined out of the fire department and EMS, and then eventually onto the Chicago PD SWAT team, and then became their lead medic. I had Brian out for a live training session that I hosted on our Facebook page, and he did about an hour and a half of different types of training. And one of the things that he said to me before that show, but he repeated it several times during that show, is that he said, Nick, the human body doesn't really care what caused the trauma. It cares that it has trauma. And so, whether you get cut by a knife or you get cut by glass, whether you get smashed in the face by a baseball bat or you get into a car accident and take trauma to the head, it's really about the same thing.
Good news about the human body is it doesn't really care what hurt it, whether it's a bullet, a knife, a car, whatever it is, a glass window. The human body reacts the same way. So I know a lot of you folks are knife practitioners. I'll talk about this stuff, but everything we're going to talk about today completely applies to those kind of wounds as well.
And so I thought that was really interesting how he just kind of related two totally separate worlds, right? You're talking about the tactical mind stuff where we're talking about gunshots and knife wounds and burns and all kinds of things versus things that you and I will encounter every single day, right? Car accidents and such. And so I'll share a few stories with you guys here that I think are worthy of consideration. In my life, I've had a chance to use anything from first aid skills all the way up to TCCC skills several times. Although I've never shot anyone, never been shot at, intentionally I should say, never had to go through wartime stories, let's just say, right? That whole, when I was in Afghanistan hiding in a hole kind of a thing. I don't have any of those kinds of stories for you guys. What I have is just everyday basic stuff. I've seen people who had seizures in the middle of Buffalo Wild Wings and had to administer medical help for them. I've seen, I've been in around probably a good 3 or 4 car accidents where I've had to place wound dressing on people because they got cut up on something that was in the car or debris that's in the car or maybe on the glass, that kind of thing. I've had to administer first aid to several people. Here's a great story for you guys. When I owned my last academy in Illinois, another student of mine, his name is Brian also, and if you're watching this, I'm sorry to tell the story, but it's such a great one for us to learn from. I was teaching a jiu-jitsu class. It was a winter day in December, cold, Chicago, right? And we were working on these drills where we were learning how to use our legs, our feet, as tools to gain distance or close distance against somebody who's standing up. So you have one person that's on the floor, flat on their back, and you have one person who's standing up. And so how do we use our feet against the person standing up? And Brian was partnered up, and initially he was the person upright on his feet, and then I had called, hey, role reverse. So now partner A does the same job that partner B does, and vice versa. And so Brian turned around, and he just made this collapse, right? And it seemed unnatural to me. And I'm standing like 10 feet away. And so I saw it right in front of me. I saw him kind of go down the floor, and he landed on his back. So he landed in the right position, but his body just didn't seem natural on the way down. And so I first thought that maybe he rolled his ankle or blew out a knee or something like that. And keep something in mind here. You guys don't know Brian, but Brian is probably one of the most best shaped people that you'd ever meet. In those days, we were in our 30s. He probably had 10% body fat, eats clean, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. He's healthy as healthy can be. And so for him to go down, you would think that it's just maybe some kind of an injury. So Brian goes down, he lays down the mat, and I'm like, hey man, you okay? He doesn't respond. So I start walking over to him. And as soon as I got to him, which is only just a few seconds later, I realized that his eyes are shut, his mouth is, hanging open. He's not breathing at all. I don't see his chest moving. I don't hear any breath coming out of his mouth or his nose. And I put my hand to check his pulse on his neck, and he's already going cold. This has been seconds. He's going cold. And when people go cold, that's an indication that the heart's not pumping, the blood pressure is dropped, and so there's no circulation happening, and so they're going cold. Essentially rigor mortis, right? And so, I yelled out to one of my other students to call 911. She called 911, and then me and two of the other students that were there, we were just kind of rotating in and out doing chest compressions. Now, if you guys have never done chest compressions on someone, it is physically taxing, okay? It takes a lot to continually be banging on their chest and trying to break through their diaphragm area and really get that chest to compress and decompress. It's work. It's not easy, especially when you're just got done working out and your stress level is up because, hey, you have a healthy guy that's on the floor, I think, dying. And so we're doing everything that we can to keep him alive and keep things moving and keep blood and air going to his brain, right? 8 or 9 minutes later, the medics show up, so they got there really fast. Kudos to them guys for being on top of it, especially snow and wind and all kinds of stuff going on. And so they come in there and they zap the dude, right? They hit him with the defibrillator, and he kind of comes to for a second, then he goes back out. They put him on a gurney, they take him out to the ambulance, they zap him again, he's back up. Now at least he's kind of coherent, where am I? He's responding to the medics and that kind of thing. And they zip him off to the hospital. Meanwhile, I got to call his missus because I have his emergency information and had to kind of break the news to her, and I really didn't even know what to say. What are you supposed to say? Oh yeah, by the way, Brian just died on the mat, but I think everything's all right. Well, I'll meet you over there. So I took the easy route, which was don't give too much information. I called her and I just said, yeah, Brian took on an injury. We had to call the medics. He's fine, he's conscious. They're taking him to this hospital. If you want, I'll come pick you up. If not, I'll meet you over there. And so she was obviously worried and had some basic questions, which I just kind of, danced around. And now we're at the hospital, right? She's there, he's there, a couple of the students are there, I'm there. And the doctor explains to her exactly what's going on. They're running a whole bunch of tests on him, x-rays and EKGs and EEGs and MRIs and all this, medical stuff, right? And they found the oddest stuff. They found, a small problem in his heart, but they don't think that was the cause of it. The cause of it was that the electrical impulse that was going from brain to heart just went haywire for a second and it needed to get reset. And so when the medics hit him with the AED, it brought him back to life. Okay. Meanwhile, the ER doctor's like, which one of you guys was working on him while he was down? And so all of us were raising our hands. All of us did to a certain degree. We just kind of rotated in and out as we were getting fatigued doing the thing, right? And the ER doctor looks at us and he goes, good job. You guys kept him alive. We're like, well, we don't even know what the hell happened, man. And he's like, he died. the electrical impulse stopped, the heart stopped, the blood flow stopped, he was done. And so, luckily, the AED came in time to get him up. But in the meanwhile, you guys working on him, giving him compressions and all that stuff, kept enough air going to his brain and blood going around that it kept him alive. And so eventually they did a procedure and put a improvised AED into him, an IAED. Looks about like a cell phone, it's in the side of him. And they install that to his heart in case that heart ever stops again, it'll automatically jumpstart him, right? Anyways, where did we learn that from? I learned chest compressions and such from first aid stuff, right? When I was 16 and working at a fitness facility, I learned how to make compressions. Has nothing to do with me being an edge weapons guy or me being a firearms guy. That was just something that I learned, right? About a year and a half ago, my brother, my niece, and I went to a Buffalo Wild Wings. And we were sitting there, and I think there was a game going on because it was super packed in the place. And there was a table next to us, and there was probably 5 or 6 youngsters. When I say youngsters, probably anywhere from 18 to 20, 22. They were just kind of hanging out and having fun. And they're all kind of talking amongst each other, just like, youngsters do and doing the thing. And I started to see how this gal started to tense up and prop up and kind of sit up in her chair. And nobody's noticing this. Nobody sees what's going on. This is an awkward behavior, right? And so I yelled. I said, she's having a seizure. And I grabbed onto her as she was falling out of the bar stool. She would have split her dome wide open if she hit the ground, right? So I caught her on the way down, noticed that she was kind of choking, and this is something that you have to keep in mind. When people go down, sometimes the tongue blocks off the airway, and so you have to reach your finger in there and pull the tongue out, and that's exactly what I had to do with her to make sure that she doesn't choke on her own tongue. Where did I learn that from? First aid, CPR, and some TCCC classes. And so these are things that we have to keep in mind. Now, let's fast forward to just a couple of years ago. I was asked to come speak and do a presentation on active shooter response at a conference in Orlando, Florida, okay? I went, did my spiel, met with people, that kind of stuff. And afterwards, this group of people come up to me. And they're like, hey man, we're medics, okay? And I'm like, oh, great, nice to meet you. And they said, we're also the first responders for the Parkland shooting, the school that went down. And I said, no kidding. I said, hey, you guys want to sit down somewhere? I'd love to ask you a bunch of questions. And so they were cool with me. And so we sat down and we started going through what they saw at the Parkland High School where the shooting just happened, right? Medics are on scene. They can't go in because the police hasn't gone in first. I don't know what their policies and rules are for EMT guys, but they apparently can't go in until police department's gone in first to start neutralizing the threat, and then the EMS guys have to go in right behind them. I think that's changed after the Parkland shooting. I think now EMS guys can go in for themselves if they need to and start dragging bodies out. And I know that some of these departments have also brought in people who are armed and are designing teams to be a good first responder, armed first responder, so that way they can lead the charge for medical guys to come in behind them. Anyways, so these guys are telling me that we can't go in the building, we're on the radio, we're about ready to go in for ourselves, all this stuff's going on, we just want to go in there and pull out bodies, and the only thing that kept on going on in our head is that, good God, I hope that somebody inside has some kind of medical training to start doing work on these kids, or else they're just not going to make it. Think about that for a second. So, we talked more in detail about some of these things and, what kind of stuff people should learn and what they shouldn't, what kind of equipment they should have and all that stuff. And we talked about the legalities behind TCCC training. And so that would have been in TCCC side of training, right? Learning how to use tourniquets and that kind of stuff. And so I thought that was an important lesson from them. So what you're looking at is a whole bunch of different things. Look, we've car accidents, active shooter stuff, people going out at Buffalo Wild Wings, a student of mine going down at in the middle of jiu-jitsu class. Like, this matters. These are everyday things, right? Well, minus the active shooter part, but we're talking about environments that you and I are in every single day. And the more environments that we're in, the more probabilities that we're going to encounter something like this. And so, there's another phrase that we use that kind of goes analogous with TCCC, and that is self-aid, buddy aid, right? And this was something that was taught to soldiers so that way you can cover yourself and cover the guy that's next to you. And statistically, it has drastically reduced combat-based deaths.
So what they did was they looked back from Vietnam forward, and they tried to figure out what was killing people on the modern battlefield. What were the causes of death? And the military, honestly, keeps very good statistics on that, and almost nobody else does. And what they figured out, they came up with a whole chart. I won't go into the whole thing for you, but then when they looked at that, they tried to figure out what were preventable deaths. Sometimes if you get hit between the running lights with a 7.62 times 39, there's not a lot I can do for you as a medic. You get hit with a 12.7 in the chest and it blows a basketball out of your back, again, there's not much I can do for that. But what they focused on was preventable deaths on the battlefield, because one of the principles of tactical combat casualty care, which is what they called their program, was that there's three kinds of casualties. People that are going to live no matter what, people that are going to die no matter what, and a small percentage of people that can be saved with good aggressive medical training. So the three things they figured out was 60% of preventable deaths on the modern battlefield, exsanguination from extremity wounds. Just a sexy way of saying I'm bleeding out of an arm or a leg. That was 60%. 33% of people on the modern battlefield were dying of a pneumothorax, which is a sexy way of saying air in the chest cavity, and then about 6% died of airway issues. So what they figured out is if you can fix three things, 99% of people in the modern battlefield will be saved. And what you saw in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan was the absolute validation of that.
Right? And we've learned a lot from being at war. We've learned a lot from seeing what the medical prognosis of these guys who have gone over there and risked their lives and taken on major injuries. And we should learn from those lessons, and how do we apply that to every single day life? And if I take those wartime stories and those lessons that those guys have sacrificed and taught us and apply it to exactly what my friend Brian from Chicago PD SWAT said, which is that the human body doesn't care what caused the trauma. It cares that there's trauma, and so it needs required care in a quick manner. Well, our boys and girls that went overseas and took on injuries, they taught us a lot. And if the human body doesn't care what caused it, then the human body doesn't care if it was a car accident or if you're in the middle of a firefight, with radical terrorists. It just doesn't matter. And for concealed carry people, that's a whole different animal, because we've taken the responsibility to be an armed citizen. Well, part of that responsibility is that we also have to be able to heal or help a human being without having to kill somebody else, right? And so, look, I guess what I should say is this. As citizen defenders, we've taken on the responsibility to protect ourselves, our loved ones, and anybody who's in the immediate area. Somebody in the immediate area goes down, we want to try and help them, okay? Your pistol's not going to always get the job done for that part of it. And so I think that medical training is a big thing that everybody should learn starting early on. And I said 15, 16 up, and I say that because that's when, teenagers are starting to drive, they're starting to get out of the house a little bit, they go hang out with their friends a little bit more, those types of things. And they can encounter trauma that's based on those types of lifestyles, right? Being out, new drivers, crash into something, run into someone, that kind of stuff. And so they should have some kind of idea of how to respond to those things, because the one thing that all of these medical things will tell you is that every second matters. The sooner you can start giving care to the human body, it will exponentially respond. The longer it takes, it will also exponentially respond in an adverse way.
Understand this clearly. No paramedic, no ambulance, no military medic, no first responder saves the life of somebody who's been injured in the field. The end game is a trauma surgeon in an appropriate facility. That's who's going to save their life. The only job that we have as first responders is to keep that patient viable and alive, do the minimum number of interventions that we can do, and then get them handed off to further care.
Buying them time, essentially.
Time's everything.
Yeah.
Time is the fire in which casualties burn. We talk about that constantly.
Okay, and so we need to be quick to it. You can't be 5 minutes behind, 10 minutes behind. It has to happen as quickly as possible. And the same reason why we as concealed carry people say, look, I conceal carry not because I want to do the job of police, but because police can't be there all the time, and there's minutes in between when I am able to call them and by the time they show up, and those are long minutes, and I have to be able to protect myself in that time. It's the same exact way when it comes to medical care. Something bad happens, somebody's going through some emergency trauma as far as their body goes, I will call 911 and ask for the medics to come, but I still have minutes for them to come, and this person needs help now, or maybe I need help right now. And so those are things that I think are important to think about just as everyday people, okay? Get involved with a good first aid CPR program, go do the AED stuff, try and find a good TCCC class that's near you. Look at other classes like Stop the Bleed, which is a nationwide class. You can find that almost anywhere. That's a great class. Most of the Stop the Bleed stuff is usually about 90 minutes long, so it's not even like time consuming that way. And do it 2, 3, 4 times a year, right? Because you kind of get, you know, a basic idea the first time you go. The second time you go, it's kind of familiar. Third time you go, you can actually kind of do something. And the fourth time you go, man, you're kind of on par. And then it's just maintenance after that. So you want to hit this as often as possible, every 3 to 4 months, something like that. I try to catch a good medical class every 6 months for myself, right? And so kind of keep that in mind. What else can you guys take a look at? Well, you can go to the Red Cross website and take a look and see when they offer the first aid CPR and the AED classes. I'm not saying you got to do the instructor certification, but how do you attend that? You can contact your local fire departments. A lot of times they'll do these trainings for free. And so they'll come to your location if you have enough bodies, or you can go to theirs if they're hosting something at their own facility. That's always a great place to get started. And then ask them, hey, what's next after this? What do you recommend? Okay? And see what they tell you. And they're gonna tell you that, hey, if you're taking a first aid CPR class, then you probably wanna get into an AED class next. Okay, and if you're taking an AED class, and you talk to somebody else, they're going to say, well, I think you should get into a TCCC class, a self-aid, buddy aid class. So I want to take just a couple minutes and talk a little bit about what it's like when you start your medical training, just to kind of give you guys some tips, which will lead right into what kind of equipment, you know, you might want to invest in, like as of today. You know, when I started my basic classes and started doing this a few years back, there used to be an acronym called ABC, Airway, Breathing, Circulation, okay? And that was kind of like a list of priorities to make sure that, you know, you would check somebody's airway, make sure that they're breathing, and then, you know, look for circulation issues.
And the thing is, if you've done any kind of medical training in the past, the thing you learned was ABC, airway, breathing, circulation.
Okay.
Got to break your mind out of that in trauma, because what kills the vast majority of people on the battlefield that are savable? Exsanguination from extremity wounds. So we changed that from ABC to CAB. We treat catastrophic bleeds first, then we worry about airway, then we worry about breathing.
And in the past, probably 3 to 4 years, when I started doing more of the TCCC kind of training, what I learned was that acronym ABC is kind of, you know, gone to the wayside, like it's outdated. And the new one that the instructors that I've been under have used is MARCH, okay? MARCH stands for massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, and then head trauma or hypothermia. And that's kind of like a list of, like a priority, right? Check these things in order. Go with MARCH.
CAB rather. So catastrophic bleeding, airway, and breathing is the mnemonic we use. MARCH E is what the military use. M's massive hemorrhage, then airway, respiratory, circulation, hemorrhage, and then E is everything else.
First thing is massive hemorrhage. Now, one of the things that we learned from, you know, looking at medical data from guys that have gone overseas and gals that have gone overseas, you know, wartime stuff, is that the leading cause by far for loss of life has been massive hemorrhage. People are bleeding to death. And so, when we start getting into TCCC stuff, you start to deal with more of the massive hemorrhaging, which is why Stop the Bleed is such a great class. I mean, the name says it, stop the bleed, okay? And so massive hemorrhage is all about controlling that bleeding and try to elongate the time frame that we can get proper medical care for this person. Airway is the second line, and that is establish and maintain airway. And I'm not saying that anybody should go out and do like a tracheotomy. What I'm saying is that, you got to pay attention to if there's an obstruction in the airway. Like I told you guys the story about the gal who went into the seizure at the Buffalo Wild Wings. I know that her tongue's fallen back, right? I can hear it in her breathing, so you stick your finger in there to pull that back out. I've had a chance to give people the Heimlich maneuver, right? Literally on the sidewalk. I've seen people choking out and Heimlich them. And so that is something that's constricting their breathing. That's an important thing to have. Respiration is obviously the process of breathing, right? And so, do we need to make compressions there, right? In and out and that kind of stuff. Now, I don't want to get too kind of gory with this, but when it comes to respiration, when you guys start doing this kind of training, you'll learn that one of the first things that you look at is closing any kind of wound cavities on the chest, because people not only lose blood through there, but they're potentially losing air as well. So we have to have the right equipment and the right wherewithal to solve that problem first, to assist in correcting the respiratory problem, right? Okay, so we have massive hemorrhage, we have airway, we have respiration. The fourth one is circulation. I don't get too deep into this one because a lot of circulation stuff requires things like IVs and IOs and administering fluids and that kind of stuff. And as citizen defenders, I don't know if I don't even want to go that far. But what I will do is do something like this. If I see somebody who's gone unconscious, the first thing that we want to do is elevate their feet and bring blood back to their brain. I actually learned that in jiu-jitsu, believe it or not, okay? Because we're getting choked unconscious sometimes. Not all the time. It wasn't like everybody was out there maliciously, putting each other to sleep. But it happens sometimes. You hold on to a choke a little bit too long, or you didn't realize that you had that that kind of strength and leverage behind it, and so people go out. And the first thing that I saw was instructors come over, grab the feet, elevate them, stick something underneath the feet so that way blood flow goes back to the brain. And it makes sense, right? Because a lot of times, you have blockages, in the carotid, which is disrupting blood flow. Could be an air choke too, but either which way, we got to get blood back to the brain, all right? And so keep that in mind when it comes to circulation aspect of things. And then the last one was hypothermia or head injury, right? Hypothermia meaning keep their body temperature at something that's reasonable, okay? Head injuries are sometimes hard to see for yourselves without having good medical stuff. You can check the dilation of the pupils and all that stuff, or sometimes it's just obvious that somebody took, a shot to the head, but sometimes it's not that obvious. And so, just don't move it around too much. Pay attention to the other things, right? The big two in the March system is massive hemorrhage and airway. If you can solve those two problems, you are probably buying some major time for this person. And so something that's simple, right? But how would you know that? How would you know what are the signs to look at? How would you know how to respond to that without having some basic information first, right? Some knowledge, some education. So if March is the kind of the nucleus of everything, then we have to think about what kind of equipment we have on hand. And so what we call the IFAC, right, the individual first aid kit, or a medical kit that's in the car, you need to have some basic first aid kind of stuff, right? Tape, wrap, Band-Aids, cool. Ice packs. For an IFAC, you tend to not have a whole lot of that because it starts to get kind of bulky. But you should have basic stuff. Shears, hemostatic gauze, chest seals, tourniquets. Between those few things, you can truly start saving lives.
What we're going to talk about from here is what I'm going to talk about, the skill set. If you're able to master what we've got on the ground right here, if you can master that kit, you're going to be able to fix the vast majority of injury patterns that you're going to find from most traumas. And again, this is not one of those things we're going to caveat this with if it's a car accident or dad fell off the roof working on it. There's going to be some things you're not going to want to move people for due to cervical spinal injuries and things like that. Again, this is going to be mostly geared around gunshot wounds, stabs, and things along those lines. One important concept, though, is that we prioritize life over limb. So if you did come up on a car accident where somebody was bleeding to death, normally you don't move somebody out of a vehicle, you let medical professionals do that. If the person's going to bleed to death otherwise, now you have to start making some decisions.
Including your own if you're the one who's been under trauma that way. And so there's great companies out there, North American Rescue Systems. There's a whole bunch of smaller companies who are making different designs for IFACs. I carry a ankle-worn IFAC system that has my shears, hemostatic gauze, a couple chest seals, and a tourniquet, and I put it on my ankle and I throw my pants over it, and nobody would ever even notice that it's there. On my gun belt when I'm on range, that's a whole different thing. In my truck, I have a little bit more expansive medical kit because it's not just about during violence, right? We talked about this. These things happen all of the time. So I guess the big lesson for today's discussion is that, the title of our series is Everything Self-Defense and Beyond. And I think that going into medical training, again, not saying you got to become an EMT or any of that stuff. I think that's such a wonderful skill for every single one of us to have. And I would highly encourage everybody from the age 15, 16, all the way up through your adult life to continually train in medical stuff. You'll use that in more places than anything else, right? As far as these kinds of skills. I'm not always going to be, behind the gun. I'm not always going to be swinging the knife or the stick or grappling with somebody or any of that stuff. But man, you just never know when you're going to run into somebody's life-threatening situation that wasn't really violence related. You know what I mean? And as a citizen defender, I want to do everything that I can to protect my community, protect myself, protect my loved ones. And that doesn't always mean that I have to be at the tip at the end of the spear. I don't have to always be the soldier. Sometimes you got to be the doctor. Sometimes you got to be the healing hand rather than the trigger hand, right? And so that's it for today's episode. Hopefully you guys got something out of that, something to at least think about. I'd love to hear more about it from you guys. Tell me what you guys think about these episodes. Like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and really take these lessons to heart.